Hello. I want to talk a little bit about interpreting lines. So, when you ask a question of the I Ching, you always get a hexagram, right? You get six lines, solid or broken. I'm just going to use this card as an example. And then, generally some of these are changing, one or more, sometimes none, but usually at least one is changing. And those changing lines give you insights into how this change, this transition, this transformation process that this card or hexagram represents is at work in your situation specifically. Sometimes those lines will seem to contradict the main idea or message that you get from the image and the description and the general stuff about that hexagram. And the reason why is because those lines are progressive, they're developmental. They represent sort of this timeline of process that is that change. And as you know, or maybe you should know, it may not have been obvious. Um, those look different at different points in time. There's many aspects or stages, and some are really different feeling, have a different vibe than others. And so that's really important to keep in mind when you're reading the lines. There are a lot of traditional ways to think about how these lines can relate to you. The most common is that sort of chronological, that the first line at the bottom is the beginning of this process, and the last line is the end of this process and all the steps in between. And that if you ask a question and you get a couple of lines, one of those may be where you were in the past on this overall process of change that this hexagram represents, and one may be where you are in the present. If you have three, there may be one that represents the future. And so that's sort of that chronological way of looking at these things. You can also, you will commonly see these um, references in the text to hierarchies or stations, roles that you can play. Like the top line is often a sage or a fool. So you've either really attained some sort of spiritual mastery over this process or transcended it. Actually, five is maybe more of an attainment line where you're the king. Um, Four is often like a prince. So like really on the path to attainment. You'll see an administrator usually in line three, and like sometimes like a soldier. These bottom two are they're kind of lay people roles. Um, and then sometimes that sixth line is a fool. It's like you kind of took it a little too far. You kind of went off the deep end with this one. And sometimes it seems like it could go either way. I find that actually the most fun and interesting when I come across a hexagram and that last line is like, yeah, I mean, you could tip either direction with that one. That's really interesting to me. I'm going to go ahead and read the lines on this card. There's actually a few other ways that you can look at the lines that are less traditional, but still very well supported. But first, I just want to look at this card, which is adornment. And it's a really good example of just sort of the way the progression works, the way those lines often tell a story about that theme of that change. So in line one of this one, we have adorning the feet. You're ready to leave the carriage. So it very much has that beginning essence, right? We're stepping out of the carriage and we have our feet properly prepared for that. The second one is adorning the beard. And that line is very much about making a social impression. And the third line says, adornments shine and bring good luck. The fourth one says, adorned in white on a horse, a suitor. So that's that idea, right, of the prince who is courting to be the king. Uh, that adorned in white on a horse is very much representative of that. And then the fifth line, I think surprises you, but if you know it's the king, it's like that secret wisdom. The fifth line is almost always the king. Humbly adorns his garden. Like that's what that line says. He humbly adorns his garden, dressed in rags, right? And so we've moved from these like adornments that are intended to go out and do this work and impress, right? They're sort of exterior adornments. And we've moved here to um, this place where the self is not adorned, but the garden is adorned. And if you think about it, that as a king, that is an appropriate mindset that you adorn your kingdom and not yourself. You adorn your work and not your person. The fifth line says, in an exalted in position, but adorned plainly with nothing to prove. And that is that sage who is just like, I am my authentic self. I have no reason to show anything with the way I adorn myself. So that's sort of like that deep wisdom that comes with the sage. I just thought that was a great example. I had some others I might pull, but let's talk a little about some of these other ways you can think about these lines beyond just the chronological translate or interpretation and this sort of hierarchical stations of society translation or interpretation. Inner to outer processes. So some will think of this these first three lines as sort of inner preparation of this change, and the final three lines as sort of an outward expression of the change. And that can make a lot of sense to think of it that way sometimes. We also see sometimes that these first two lines are considered the world, the second two man or yourself, and the top two heaven. So this sort of bridging quality of the lines. I think with the inner and outer interpretation, that really draws attention to this place between the third and fourth line, which is often very significant. It's usually a leap. It's a breakthrough. It's it does show a journey to a different world in a way. When you read these lines, often there's a very big transition that happens between three and four, which I think is lovely to think about that in terms of this sort of being an internal and external, or even like an earthly and spiritual sort of jump here. The other I have seen is sort of this idea that it kind of radiates from yourself out into the different planes, right? And so we see you, those around you, this sort of more community or global sphere. We might see then up here a more spiritual sphere. That also makes can sometimes having these options for interpretation, they don't really conflict with each other. They all work with each other, and you don't have to think about them all at the same time because that's a lot. But sometimes one or more will resonate better with your situation. It will be really helpful to know, to have these tools to lean back on and say, well, um, in this particular case, I can very much see the past, present, future at work, or in this case, I can really see that movement from inner to outer, or from where here I'm really influencing some community around me. Like those, having those in your pocket is really useful. Another one I've seen that I really love is thinking about all six lines as within the self. So where that this one we just talked about really starts with you and spreads outwards into the world. I love the idea of also considering that entire world within yourself. So in this way of interpreting, you kind of see layers of perception. The first layer being the material, your senses, you're seeing, you're smelling, you're touching, the physical layer of perception. And in the second line, you might see the subconscious, your sort of primal instincts, your base impulses, these things that are sort of hidden in that sort of way. And then the third layer of perception, you would see the emotional life. The fourth layer, you would see the thinking life, the thought. that sort of shapes those things, sorts those things, gives order, right? And in the fifth line, you would see this sort of what I've heard referred to as like the melon heart, sort of the higher consciousness that thought and emotion when they are well matched or balanced can bring sort of insights or intuition. Truths become revealed when you're able to really balance and integrate those things together. And then that sixth line, that final line would be true spiritual revelation. And so that's another way to look at these progressions when you're interpreting something and where you might be in that process or attainment of sort of that sort of revelation from your higher self or that um, advice from your higher self, right? So I hope maybe that helps you. I'd love to hear about um, ways you have seen or heard of interpreting these lines and bringing them into sort of an elevated information for your readings. Leave that in the comments.